and welcome to Let's Pod This. My name is Andy Moore. We are just days away from the beginning of the 2022 legislative session, and boy, oh boy, what a wild week it's been. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the state budget, how it's looking, what we expect the governor and the legislature will prioritize when it comes to spending your money, my money, our money, taxpayer money. And we're also going to, talk about what issues we hope they'll consider, what things we think that they should be talking about in those budget negotiations. Here to discuss these matters are my colleagues, Bailey Perkins Wright. Hello, Bailey.
Hello, Andy.
And Scott Melson. Hello, Scott.
What's up, dude?
What's up? We are also joined by special guest this week, Emma Morris, who is a policy analyst for healthcare and revenue at the Oklahoma Policy Institute. Welcome, Emma.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Before we get into discussing the state budget, we wanted to talk about two rather extraordinary news stories this week that do deal with state funds. I think it all weaves together because it deals with two of the state's largest agencies. I don't remember which. I think education is probably the largest agency, but I don't know if health is next or OMES. Do you guys have any feel for what's the second largest agency by revenue size?
It's probably
DHS,
healthcare. Yeah, I would say probably DHS, Healthcare Authority, due to Medicaid,
sure.
and yeah,
that's probably right.
That's fair. All right, of our 700 plus state agencies. All right, so first up, the Tulsa World reported earlier this week that State Auditor Cindy Byrd had reported to the legislature that her office's audit into Epic charter schools, for gross misuse of public education funds was, quote, the largest abuse of taxpayer funds in the history of the state. That's a bold statement. Auditor Cindy Byrd was not sure.
We have had some shady abuse of taxpayer funds in our past, so that is quite the claim.
And it feels like this investigation has been going on for at least a couple of years now. So it seems like our state auditor has really gotten the details and the information needed to be able to make such a claim at that level.
Yeah. And so I think OSBI, right, the State Bureau of Investigation, has just completed their year-long investigation. And I think prior to that is when the auditor did theirs. And the interview in the Tulsa World article was basically asking Cindy Byrd, well, why hasn't the AG filed criminal charges yet? And Cindy Byrd was like, I don't know. Like, she all but said, it's a clear-cut case. This was criminal. It's the largest largest abuse of taxpayer funds in the history of the state. And he should be filing charges. Now,
Twitter speculates it's a follow the money kind of issue, but that's just what Twitter's saying. Right. Follow those campaign donations.
Yeah, Twitter says it by posting screenshots of the state's Guardian, right, their ethics reporting campaign donation website. So it's not just pure speculation. It's, I guess, the intent is the speculation, but the numbers are what the numbers are, right? And the numbers are that the co-founders of Epic Charter Schools, two guys, Ben Harris and David Cheney, who are the guys that are being investigated here, are essentially mega donors in our state, right? They have donated to Governor Stitt, to Education Secretary Ryan Walters, who is currently running for state superintendent. They donated to State Senator Zach Taylor, who has been an outspoken advocate for vouchers, right? Which is, I think listeners probably know, but vouchers are basically a way to redirect public funding from education from public schools to private schools or charter schools. And according to the Guardian system, if you look up each of them and their campaign donations over the last, I guess, 6 years, right? Since 2015, they have each individually donated more than $100,000 to either statewide electeds or state legislators. Anyway, $100,000 in 5 years is a lot of money.
It's a lot. It's 100,000, and it's 100,000 each, right? It's 100,000 each, and I don't know if Mr. Harris and Mr. Cheney have other sources of revenue that would allow them, like, would give them the means to just drop $100,000 on political contributions. But given the revenue that they've gotten from Epic, you could think that this is like taxpayer money into Epic, into their pockets, now into politicians, right? Like, it's a circle. Like, these are tax dollars that are flowing through Epic to them and then back around to the politicians who write the laws. That seems
Well, Scott, it's just ironic that the conversation lately has been the money should follow the student. The money should go, not just to an institution, when we're seeing the money go into the pockets of some shareholders, right? Like, and I think that's something that all Oklahomans should be concerned about, especially with we focus a lot on our brick and mortar public institutions, but this should really present a red flag of where are our public dollars going for in this virtual education setting.
And it's also important to note that these are just the donations that are publicly reportable to individual candidates. This doesn't account for donations to PACs or super PACs, right? Because depending on the entity, those are not tax deductible, but they also don't have to be publicly reported. Individual candidate donations are capped out at $2,700. So, I mean, 100,000 each at 3,000 a pop. So they've either each given like one politician 30 donations of 2,700, or they've given 30 politicians one donation of 20. Like, they've done some work here, right? Like, this is a lot of money that's either being spread out over a number of people or over a number of years, or both.
Right. And it's important to know. Like, this is just them as individuals. If they're married or anything, it doesn't include their spouses, right? So it could be twice as much for all we know. And they are limited by law to that $2,700 per candidate per election, right? So you can give in the primary, in the runoff, in the general, all of that. And I didn't go through to like see how much was in each cycle or whatever. All I saw was the total was $100,000 for one and like 105,000 for the other in 5 years. That's a lot of, or 6 years. That's a lot of money. And I think has gone to a number of politicians, right? And I also haven't had time yet to go back through to see if all their donations lined up with how people voted on some of these things. But it's safe to say that I think if we were going to recap, let's do it this way. The Epic co-founders gave money to politicians. The politicians then changed laws, right, to allow Epic and other schools like them to get more taxpayer money. Those co-founders then illegally routed a huge chunk of that money that went to Epic into their private, quote, school management business, right? Epic Youth Services, isn't that what it was called, right? So they had this private company that was managing Epic charter schools, and they were skimming a pretty hefty percentage off of that over to this private business, which is a black hole, right? It's not a public entity, so we don't know anything about it. And they just kept doing that until they got caught, right? Then the state auditor was called in to do an investigation. Her office investigated. It was obviously criminal enough that OSBI got involved, which is never a good sign. They investigated for a whole year, and it's all done. And yet, no charges have been filed yet. Now, they might be in the future, but they haven't been filed yet, even though all this has happened. And also, we still see in the news that Secretary Walters and Senator Taylor are continuing to push for vouchers, which would allow for more of this, rerouting of money to schools like Epic. Now, these two guys don't have any affiliation with Epic anymore. The board severed all those ties. But I wouldn't be surprised, given how these things typically play out, right? If they are in the process or have already set up some other kind of charter school, right? Like, usually you see folks that develop some kind of racket like this, they will keep doing it until they can't do it anymore.
Well, we also see some diversion conversation with the rise of teachers getting paid six figures, right? That 100K To me, that just sounds like, let's not talk about this. Let's look over this way. But I will say I am grateful for Cindy Bird's political courage and being willing to continue to shed light on this issue and to continue to take on some powerful folks who have a lot of money, right? And who are giving it to a lot of folks. So,
Yeah. I mean, this is why our state has a state auditor that's a statewide elected office, right? Because the people need someone to go in and investigate this kind of stuff, right? To look at the books, to look at the policies and procedures, to really work it out. And isn't so? It said that her office did an investigative audit, and that's like the high level audit, right? Don't they? They have like a regular audit that's like, let's see your books, and then there's like an investigative audit, which is
you've been
looking.
accused of something.
They're looking for criminal wrongdoing. Yeah. Scott, were you about to say something?
I was, and then I changed my mind.
Okay, fair enough. Well, so that was one thing. That was on, I think, Tuesday of this week. And then on Thursday, the Frontier was reporting that the Attorney General, John O'Connor, is now refusing to release the investigative audit of the State Department of Health. And his office won't even really say why, right? And so, as we just said, investigative audits are that high level of audit conducted by the state auditor's office that are looking for criminal or civil wrongdoing. And when the Frontier asked, like, why won't you release it? They basically said, we don't have to. But it's clearly not good, right? And this is looking into, again, misuse of public funds related to buying COVID supplies. Early on, there was
Or
at some point
was it the hydra? What's the
hydroxychloroquine.
term? Yes,
Yeah.
that word. Yeah, remember we purchased 2 million of that, and then it was like, my bad.
Right. It's in the garage though. We got it still. Well, and part of this was because they spent like $10 million on stuff that they had not received. And now in follow-up, they're like, well, we either got it or we canceled it. We're working on getting a refund. And it's just like, this is taking a long time for $10 million. That's a lot of money.
And then, Andy, don't forget that we're building a whole facility for a new Department of Health in a whole nother community that may also be tied into whatever these findings are.
Is Cindy Bird, is she not allowed to release the audit herself? Like, is that the sole purview of the AG, or can the state auditor not release an audit that she has done?
I'm very interested in that as well. Because the way it was worded was that she gave the audit to the AG. Now,
but did the AG's office, did Mike Hunter ask for the audit? Because
yes,
that may be the determining factor. If Hunter asked for it, then it may be that she can't release it because she didn't initiate it, right? Like, man, I wonder if that's the deal.
But does the auditor initiate anything on their own? I thought generally they had to be asked to go in and look at something.
I thought they could in certain circumstances, but maybe you're right. We have had, I think, state auditor Bird on when she was a candidate. We had the previous state auditor on and had a great conversation with him. He was working his cattle at the time we talked to him, and it was awesome. He was literally in a field running cattle when he did the interview.
Cows mooing. That was a good episode.
But I'd have to go back and revisit that. You may be right. It may be that she cannot initiate an investigative audit without a request from the speaker, the governor, or from the AG. That may be,
yeah.
You may be accurate.
We'll have to. I'll send some text messages here in a moment, see if we can get an answer while we're.
It is just infuriating though, right? Because, like, we hear all this. I mean, it's just. I don't know. I'm not going to say anything we don't already know, but like we hear all of this talk about transparency and good government, and we're standing up for the people of Oklahoma. We're fighting back against Biden. Like we're fighting back against the federal. wasteful spending and federal overreach. But here we have an audit that looks at how the health department may have misspent, somewhere in the neighborhood of $20 million, and we're not going to share it with the public, right? I mean, it's just the hypocrisy in order to do political damage control is just mind-blowing. And it's a credit, I think, to our local journalists who have done really a great job of trying to shine a spotlight on this. And obviously we're trying to do it here too, but I don't know I don't know what the political pressure points are on John O'Connor to try and get him to release this. I mean, obviously he's running for election he's trying to get elected this year. He's not running for re-election. He's never been elected, but he is running to be elected back into his current position. So I hope this becomes a campaign issue. I would like to see him have to answer questions about this in a public forum or a debate or something.
Well, and didn't the Epic investigation exist before the current AG's tenure? So that had to have been triggered when Mike Hunter was AG, and to me, that makes a difference between what's happening with the audit of Department of Health and the Epic situation. Because I wonder too, if that hadn't been initiated when it was, a year and a half, 2 years ago, would we even have the information and the light shed that we have on that area of fraud and fraudulent activity?
Yeah. I'm very curious what's in this audit, right? What it says about how some of this stuff is playing out internally in these organizations, right? And this is the whole reason that we have sunshine laws like the Open Records Act, the Open Meeting Act, right? Is so that the public can be a check on our government, right? So that we have some oversight, that we can be our own watchdog. So I'm going to find out. Scott, I think your question is very important, right? And I don't know what the laws are if the auditor is allowed to release it. Now, we all know that on occasion, documents make their way into the public hands, right, through dubious means, right, or well-intentioned but secretive means. I'd love for someone to drop off an envelope with this audit on my front porch. That would be a huge help. I think on behalf of Oklahoma, I'd be happy to share that with the media, but I don't have any ins into that office, and I don't know anyone willing to risk their.
We won't ask any questions.
Just give me the audit. So we'll see. I think this also highlights the politics of the position of Attorney General, right? There were some cases that Hunter was working on when he was in office, and then he resigned and they went away. And now there's stuff like this that disappears for most of us, right? When you come in and you take someone else's position, like someone leaves a job, you're the next person hired, you continue what work they were working on already, right?
But it's important to remember that John O'Connor was not hired by the people of Oklahoma. He was appointed by this governor, right? And so he may be operating based on that appointment status, right? Because what happens, my assumption is that he'll run for the seat permanently whenever the attorney general seat is open, right? And what does that look like for support of your base and all of that if you are fighting against the person who appointed you, right? Or the current leadership. And so that puts him in a difficult position. So at least with Mike Hunter, he was elected by the people of Oklahoma, and that's who he had to be accountable to more so than someone who has been appointed to this role.
Right? Like that's the thing. Like because he's running for the spot right now. Like he's running for AG in November of this year. And that's what I'm saying. I would love to see this become a point of contention in the campaign. If assuming he gets out of the primary, I'd love to have him have to answer questions about this, because I think there's no question. I mean, maybe there's a question. I haven't seen the audit. But yeah, I think you're right, Bailey, that this would not make the governor look great.
Yeah, Bailey, I think that's a really great point. He was not elected by the people, right? He was not chosen by us to be our AG. He's appointed by someone who is in a higher office that almost certainly has his own agenda, right? As evidenced by the mountain of lawsuits they filed regarding the McGirt decision, a mountain of which they've lost all of them so far, right? So um, that it seems like it's been all hands on deck for that issue alone, and everything else is like, who cares? Waste,
But
fraud,
you know what?
abuse, nobody cares.
Yeah, and I mean, it's typical for elected leaders to make political decisions in campaign years, right? But Andy, to your point, like this is too great of an issue, and to Scott's point, this is a lot of money, just to say we're not going to tell the people because we don't want to and we don't have to, right? Um, and I'm interested too to see, what kind of discussion comes from that, especially over time. Like, if both of them are elected in November, all of a sudden do we get transparency legislation and acts in you know January 2023? Like but during a campaign year, it's very typical for people to sweep under the rug what doesn't make you look the best, but elevate the things that are going to make you shine for that election year. But this is just too important for that.
This reminds me, let me read you a quote from an Oklahoman story in July of last year, 2021. Quote, regarding professional competence, which encompasses such qualities as intellectual capacity, judgment, writing, and analytical abilities, knowledge of the law, and breadth of professional experience, the committee found Mr. O'Connor to be not qualified. The consensus based on confidential peer review is that Mr. O'Connor lacks sufficient litigation experience going to the depth and breadth of his law practice to date. His judgment was also found to be deficient. The committee also evaluated the integrity of Mr. O'Connor by considering his character and general reputation in the legal community, as well as the nominee's industry and diligence. In this category as well, Mr. O'Connor was found to not be qualified. The confidential peer review revealed several instances of ethical concerns, including candor with the court, evidence of overbilling clients, and billing practices criticized by courts, and improper ex parte communication with the court, and improper contact with adverse parties in litigation. That is from a letter dated August 18th, 2018, from the American Bar Association, their letter about Mr. O'Connor, A.G. O'Connor, when he was nominated to the federal bench, right? So it does seems
bad.
Seems bad. That's not great, Dan. Yeah.
Or maybe it doesn't seem surprising, right? That the behaviors of what we're seeing align with that written testimonial from the ABA, right?
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, now that we have, I think, sufficiently addressed taxpayer money and it's being misspent or misused or abused in some cases, and it's just interesting they both intersect with the current attorney general. Now's a good time to talk about the state budget, and that is why policy analyst Emma Morris is with us today. Of course, Emma, a couple of weeks ago during the Oklahoma Policy Annual Budget Summit, you gave a presentation on the subject of the state budget that was really excellent. Let's hit the highlights. Like maybe can you start with what kind of shape is the state in financially as we go into this session?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are actually in a relatively good spot as we go into this legislative session. The Board of Equalization has estimated that we'll have more revenue this year than we have in recent years, which I'm sure everyone has heard has led to a lot of talk about the largest budget in state history and things like that. It's important to remember that just because in nominal dollars it's the largest budget doesn't mean that we have the same capacity to invest in our state services and the same capacity to spend. When we adjust for inflation and for population growth, this budget is about $1 billion less than it was in the year 2000. It is the largest budget we've seen since fiscal year 2010, which is, good news. That means we have some opportunities to maybe make some investments in Oklahomans. But we also have to remember that, Oklahoma sees ups and downs. We see mountaintops and valleys. And so taking steps now to think about what do we do whenever we see another valley will be really important this session as well.
So, Emma, when you say that we have the largest budget that we've seen since 2010, please tell me why we shouldn't immediately cut taxes.
Great question. The inclination is often to cut taxes whenever we see these high revenue years. But that is pretty much the reason that we've never made it back to the amount of revenue that we had in that year 2000. Because when we have mountaintop, we are quick to cut, and that money has rarely, if ever, come back. So we have this thing in Oklahoma called State Question 640. I'm sure a lot of your listeners know about it. But basically, in Oklahoma, in order to raise revenue, a bill has to get a 3/4 majority in the legislature or a majority vote of the people. And so there's been one major revenue raising bill that has passed through the legislature since State Question 640 was passed in 1992. And so effectively, once we cut taxes, they don't come back, right? It takes a whole lot of political will to make them come back. And again, that's only happened one time.
So, Emma, I thought the way that it works is that we cut taxes, and then when we cut taxes, that's like pouring gasoline on the fire that is the Oklahoma economy, and that money comes back into the treasury tenfold in the form of increased revenue. So if we've cut taxes so many times, why don't we have why are we now just bursting at the seams with all the revenue? Are you saying that that's wrong?
I am indeed saying that that's wrong. We have been sold that story for a while, that tax cuts are going to be helpful for the economy. They're going to ultimately be good for state revenue. That hasn't really played out in Oklahoma. We have consistently cut taxes, and we haven't seen a massive economic boom that we thought we would. We have instead seen, growth that's below the regional average of our surrounding states. We've seen lower job growth. Ultimately, this can tell us that these tax cuts haven't worked, and maybe it's time to start thinking about taking a different approach of investing those public dollars in services that will then, services that we all use, and then those services and that money in the economy is going to come back and bolster our state budget as well.
Emma, you sound like a socialist.
I have a couple of questions for you, and this will be helpful context to our listeners, because one of the things that are also mentioned in this season is that Oklahoma has a lot of money right now, and money in the reserves due to the inflow of American Rescue Plan Act funds, from CARES Act funds, and other pandemic relief support. And that's really kept the state afloat and ahead in ways that, could have been devastating over the past few years. Can you talk about that challenge of reliance on one-time funds with that conversation about the loss of tax revenue? Because I feel like that's one piece of why lawmakers are so eager to find ways to, I guess, what they frame as putting money back in the pockets of Oklahomans and cutting these taxes, is because it seems like it's a sunny day, right? And then the second question I wanted to lift for you, because we talked about, so well, ensuring that we have a budget that adequately meets the needs and not looking at necessarily a dollar value. Talk about what are those needs that are out there, right? What still isn't being met even with a record budget year by nominal value.
Yeah, for sure. So one-time funding, you're right. We do have a lot coming in. We have increased tax revenue this year. We, like you said, have federal money from the CARES Act and from the American Rescue Plan. And it's good. It's good that we have all this money. It will hopefully be good whenever the legislature makes those investments in things that we've been putting off or one-time projects that need to happen. But the thing is, this money isn't going to last forever, right? The federal money won't last forever, just like the increased tax revenue won't last forever. We're going to see it just like with any economy, and especially in Oklahoma, when we rely so much on oil and gas, we're going to see ups and downs, right? And so if we do things like cut taxes now when we do have this influx of money, we're going to feel those impacts much harder in future years whenever we have lean years. So it's really important that we approach this legislative session in a way that we approach this legislative session not with the intent of cutting taxes because we have this high revenue, but rather, thoughtfully thinking about maybe how can we sustain some of this increased revenue? What can we do now to prepare for the future? And then as far as, some of the needs that Oklahoma has, there are a ton, and I couldn't begin to name all of them right now, but I will start by saying that the public agencies, the state agencies that are providing services to Oklahomans, like the ones you guys were talking about earlier, the Healthcare Authority, the Department of Education, so many other agencies, they know what sort of money they would need to meet some of the needs in Oklahoma, right? So the legislature has been holding budget hearings, asking these agencies what they need. And I think it's really important that the legislature listen to that, right? These are the experts. They're the people doing the work every day that know what Oklahomans need. So hopefully these budget hearings will be taken seriously, and agencies will be able to honestly say what they need in order to continue to meet the needs of Oklahomans. One example that is often used to talk about the lack of investment in Oklahoma is our waiting list for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. There are over 5,000 people in Oklahoma who need home and community-based care in order to live their everyday lives, right? But these 5,000 people have not been able to get that assistance. Oklahoma could invest in that program. We could make the choice to ensure that all of those individuals are able to get that care, but we haven't done that yet. We also have even after Medicaid expansion, we have a high rate of uninsurance. We have a lot of pregnant and postpartum people who don't have health insurance. And so, again, the state could choose to invest in those individuals, choose to make sure that no one leaves the hospital after giving birth without coverage, but we haven't made that choice yet. And
don't we need revenue to give $100,000 to our best and brightest teachers?
We absolutely need to invest in public education. I think that most of us, all of us on this call would agree that public education is like a cornerstone of our society. And as much as we can invest and as much as we can support teachers and students, we're going to see those benefits for years to come, right? Making that investment now is like a down payment on the future of our state.
Absolutely. And I said that in jest, but in all seriousness, we still have other areas, because one of the areas is we haven't raised salaries of professional staff, right? So when teachers saw that pay increase, there were others who support the education infrastructure who weren't able to see those same increases. And even the teacher salary increase still wasn't enough, for what teachers need to be able to have a strong quality life in this economy, right? And so thanks for lifting, just a few of the many things that we could do with that revenue.
Yeah, in your presentation slides, which I will link to in the show notes. So, listeners, both of you, if you're interested in this, in the show notes, there's a link and it has all the slides from the video of the presentation from the annual budget summit. It's actually slide 22 that I'm referring to. It says lower taxes and lower spending aren't boosting our economy. And this was such an eye-opening slide, right? Where I think, and you can explain it better than me, Emma, but I think the takeaway is the things that we are told are going to boost the economy in many cases have had the opposite effect, or at the very least, it has not been as pronounced as it is in our region, right? So it's different for us. Can you specifically maybe explain the impact of taxes, spending, and then the output? And I like how you guys broke out oil and gas separate from the rest of the economy.
Yeah, for sure. So I did this in conjunction with my former colleague, Paul Shin. We got to work on this together. And I definitely want to give credit where it's due. So we looked at the impact of taxes and spending in Oklahoma and then in our surrounding states. So we looked at the average of our surrounding states. And I'll start with taxes. So in Oklahoma, we spend almost 12% less, or I'm sorry, we tax almost 12% less than we used to. And in our region, the average of our surrounding states tax about 5% less than they used to. And so all of us have cut taxes, right? Or the majority of these states have cut taxes, but we have not seen anywhere near the output or the job growth that our surrounding states have. If we look at spending, we are spending less now. Whereas our surrounding states are spending more. And it's a little confusing because how are they taxing less and spending more? But it has a lot to do with like federal spending, maybe an increase in things like fees on certain things, tolls, things like that. So however they've gotten there, they are spending more, and they're spending more than we are. So we looked at output generally, and then we also looked at output without oil and gas. At first, when you look at output, and that's just economic output. So what sort of growth have we seen in the economy? It just general output. We are about on par with our surrounding region. We appear to have seen pretty typical growth. But what Paul and I did is we took out the oil and gas impact on that output because, as we all know, the oil and gas industry is very volatile. A lot of legislators have pointed to that as a problem in our state and the way that we run the budget. So it's a very unpredictable industry. So we took out oil and gas from that economic growth for us and for our surrounding states. And when we do that, we can see that our economic growth has actually been significantly less than the growth in our surrounding states. So that's like a whole lot of numbers and policy talk, but basically it's telling us that although we have been told that lower taxes is good, that lower public spending is good, that's not actually playing out in Oklahoma.
Yeah, I remember when you showed the slide and I was like, wait, so we've cut taxes more than other states, but our output is not near as high as them. And it was such an eye-opening moment. And then as you go on in the presentation, you explain how that those tax cuts and spending cuts, more importantly, tax cuts have benefited some people way more than others, and spending cuts have hurt some people way more than others. And it's opposite groups, right? Tax cuts tend to really benefit the wealthy, and spending cuts tend to really hurt the poor. And I mean, I think I applaud OK Policy because you find new ways to say the same thing year after year, right? Our tax system is regressive. It's hurting people with lower income. Why is it so regressive? What can we do to fix it? People of color pay more. Women end up paying more. People who live in rural areas end up paying a higher percentage of their income in taxes. These are all like super important things that I think we all need to think about when we're buying groceries, when we're at the gas pump, when we're out spending money, looking at our checkbooks, right, on Friday and wondering how you're going to get through the rest of the month, and recognize that there is a direct correlation on state tax policy, right, and how much money that we as workers, as individuals, get in our paychecks, right? Like it has an impact on everybody's paycheck.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that all of that is absolutely true. Also, spending cuts hurt all of us, right? Like we often think that spending cuts means, you know, less spending on things like Medicaid or other services that maybe I don't qualify for, right? But in reality, spending cuts hurt all of us. It means our roads are worse off. It means our kids have teachers that are paid less. It means our textbooks are older. So the spending cuts that we've seen really have hurt everyone in Oklahoma, right? It's not just an impact on low-income Oklahomans. So that's something to keep in mind as well.
Emma, I would love for you to talk about the process, because I think just as much as we are talking about the system in itself and the ways that our tax system is designed, the process also plays a role in continuing how our system remains the same year after year, and who gets to have input and all of that. So can you talk about how Oklahoma is different maybe from other places and some of the challenges in our appropriation and budget processes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Bailey, feel free to jump in as well, since I know you spend so much time at the Capitol working on this too. So objectively, Oklahoma is a less transparent place than it used to be. We recently released a report on the transparency of the budget process, and spoiler, it's not great compared to other states. We introduce our budget later in session. We have fewer budget bills. We pass the budget much quicker in relation to other states, but also than we used to in Oklahoma. So, in the 80s and 90s, there were a lot more budget bills in Oklahoma. A lot more people had influence in the process. Obviously, I was not around then, but as I said earlier, Paul Shin was actually working in the House during the 90s. And so he was able to sort of compare how it used to be through his experiences and talking with people who were there as well, and then what we do now. So as far as what we do now, there's typically one budget bill. The whole budget goes into one bill. There are limits bills that say, this much money has to be spent on this in the Department of Education or whatever. And so that one budget bill is typically negotiated by different people, the Speaker of the House, the Senate Pro Tem, the governor, a few other folks. And they come to a consensus. And then typically the last week or two of session, there's a press conference where they talk about what's in the budget. And then within a few days, the budget is rushed through committee and then voted on in the chamber of both chambers. And typically what this means is that there's not really time for any real debate or legislative questioning. It's typically, the expectation is that you vote for it and that it passes. And it really doesn't give people in the minority party or even people in the majority party who have questions or disagreements time. And then the last thing I'll say on that is that in Oklahoma, we don't have any opportunity for public comment, right? So people can contact their legislator and say, I want you to vote like this on the budget. But they can't go to a budget hearing and say, I wish that the state did this. And that's actually not normal. A lot of other states do have that. The majority of other states do have that option. And so Oklahomans are really kept out of the budget process, which is really keeping us from being able to comment on how it's going and to make our voices heard about how we feel.
Emma, why is it so different here than other places? Is it just structure, or why is it worse now than it used to be? What is different about Oklahoma? I saw a stat the other day. It might have even been from OK Policy, that like the average state legislature debates their budget for like 82 days or something, and in Oklahoma it's like 4. Like what do other states do differently that their legislature spends so much more time talking about the budget in view of the public?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that stat did come from OK Policy. That's in our report, I believe. So in other states, they often introduce their budget, first couple weeks of session, and it is voted on just like any other bill. So it has to pass committee, it has to pass the House, the Senate committee, and then the Senate floor. And so in Oklahoma, our budget is really exempt from those rules. We don't have to follow that, whereas every other bill has to go through that process. And the other
Emma, I would add, technically it does, but it's so rushed, right?
Right.
It goes through the Joint Committee on Appropriations and Budget, known as JCAP, right? Where both chambers are hearing the same bill at the same time, and then it advances to the floor. And then, so it goes through almost this expedited process that technically checks the box, but it's not the same. It doesn't have the same length of time as these other bills, right? And it's when we're talking about, transparency and processes and things, it technically does those things, but not in a way that truly draws the ability for the people or even different agencies and others to truly weigh in on the implications of those appropriation decisions. I worked in Arkansas for 2 years, and that's something I loved when I worked for that think tank, was being able to testify before legislative committees and talk about, in my area at the time, education policy. And then coming back home to Oklahoma, not being able to do that, it makes it so challenging. And so I appreciate you raising that point, that like in other places, the budget bill is treated like other bills, to where the people and even the press have the opportunity to have public conversation and dialogue about it. But that quick turnaround through the committee, then straight to the floor, then to the governor's desk, gives zero time for the people to deliberate.
Yeah.
Well, but that's my question. So in other states, is it required that the bill be introduced? Because that's the thing, like what Bailey said, like they rush it through, and there are some special rules that apply to the budget. But like in other states, I mean, I would guess that in most states, just like in most governments, the budget is the most contentious thing. And so what we have always heard from Oklahomans, like the reason for this is, well, the budget's the thing that's like, we have to do the most happening over, so we're going to get all the other stuff done first because that's not as hard. Like to me, there should be, well, sure,
right? Because you bring everybody's stuff together, so then you can't even everybody either wins and loses at the same time, right? Like that's the rationale.
But to me, there should be a rule that's like the budget bill, like the budget has to be introduced like the first week, like it has to be. Or like maybe now the flip side of this is if you did this, they probably wouldn't get anything else done. You can't pass any other legislation until you pass the budget, right? Like, but then what would happen is it would be at the last week of May, and they'd be like, well, we finished the budget. Now we have 4 days to pass 2,000 bills. So
yeah, and some states do have like either legislation or rules saying you have to introduce it by this time, or it has to meet every other deadline, like the deadline that every other regular order bill meets. And so some states do have that. In Oklahoma, we could do that. We could pass legislation. We could also, change the rules in the legislature. So we have a couple different ways to get there. The other thing I always like to say here is that this isn't the result of like current legislators' choices. It's sort of the result of it's the culmination of a lot of choices over the last 30-ish years, where people have changed one rule here and then another rule there. And so I just want to reiterate that it's not, the current appropriations chairs are trying to make this process less transparent. It's just that we've gotten here over the course of a few decades.
They're also not trying to make it more transparent.
That's fair.
But
I will say, though,
two people to
Chairman
do it.
Wallace, Chairman Wallace and Chairman Thompson are, I think, do have an interest in transparency, and they have mean, they can only push back so far, right? We have seen in recent years, right, where an AB chairman pushed back too hard and lost their chairpersonship, right? So there's a recognition that like maybe they could do more harm or more good than harm if they toe the line a little bit. Uh, it, Emma, to your point about the condition we're in now is a result of decisions that were made in the past, right? And some history. I do want to remind listeners about, I mean, honestly, what was going on when we first started Let's Fix This in 2016. The budget in 2016 was uh, terrible, the complete opposite of this year, right? We had a $1.6 billion budget shortfall. Everybody was getting cut on top of a decade of cuts they'd already received. Like every state agency was getting cut. And the reason that we were in that hole was that about 10 years before that, not quite 10 years, 8 years before that, in the 2008, 2009 financial crisis, right? The economy tanked across the country, including here in Oklahoma, a little bit later, but still tanked. And to invigorate our economy, the state legislature in like 2010-ish, around there, 2009, passed a tax cut, or they passed a trigger bill that said, okay, the
On income
economy is
tax.
low, but if the economy grows a certain percentage, then it triggers a reduction in the state income tax rate, right? And so that makes, because they're like, well, we won't need as much money. If the economy's growing, we can tax less and keep a flat budget, which makes a lot of sense, except the fact that the economy tanked and then started to improve. So the economy grew from like abysmal to mostly terrible, right? Like went from -5 to -4, and that triggered a tax cut. Well, we weren't out of the hole. And so it compounded over several years and led to this, $1.6 billion budget shortfall. And from talking to legislators then, most of whom weren't in office when that trigger bill was passed, they all were like, "Ooh, man, that was a bad idea way back then. I wasn't here. It wasn't my bad idea, but now we got to figure out how to fix it." And none of them were willing
Yeah,
to
but they all
undo it.
voted for the people who passed it though, right? I mean, let's get serious. Like it's not like they wouldn't have done the same thing. And the thing was what's so frustrating about this is one, people like Emma and the folks at OK Policy have been saying this for 25 years, not you specifically, Emma, but there's this idea that like there's this caricature that like conservatives only want to cut taxes and progressives only want to raise taxes, which is probably to some degree true, except that both of them are important. Both of them are important policy tools that the legislature really should have in their pocket to use if they need to. If the economy is tanking, a tax cut actually makes a lot of sense, right? Like you can put money in people's pocket and try to stimulate spending to jolt the economy out of its stagnation. But then when the economy improves, one, you can use a tax cut to try and keep it from getting, right? You can use a tax increase to try and keep it from getting too hot and trying to control inflation, but also to put money in the bank for the future. Which you want to have both levers, right? And what the folks at 23rd and Lincoln seem like they've never been able to understand is that when you cut and cut and cut and cut and cut and cut, then when you have a period like 2016 where you could really benefit from a tax cut, you can't do it anymore. Because if you cut taxes again, there'll literally be no money, right? Whereas if the income tax had been at 9% in 2016, you could have cut it by 3% for 2 years and maybe juiced the economy. Like if they would not be so short-sighted and only think 6 months or one election cycle at a time, they would actually make their jobs so much easier.
But Scott, that's how it's been structurally designed. And it's not even about what political party is in power, right? These structures have been there for a long time, even when Democrats had control, Republicans had control, and it takes an act of God oftentimes for major reforms to happen, because if the current minority was in the majority, they would be using the same tools to advance their perspective on the budget, right? And so I think that's the other piece that we have to keep in mind too is like this isn't something new over the past 12 to 15 years with a shift in party control, but this is a real conversation of how do we depoliticize some of the processes that don't make it advantageous to whichever ideology gets control, but more so build processes that are neutral and fair that also ensure involvement of the people, and the hard part is how you get there is tough because this has been rooted into the politics of it all.
That's exactly right, Bailey. And I think it's worth noting, right, that there is a role here that we haven't discussed. It's not just legislators, it is voters, it is us, right? Some of Not that we are the ones that are passing policy, but we have a voice, right? We have the ability to influence policy uh, for the greater good, right? And so, as we say at the end of every episode, decisions are made by those who show up and by simply showing up, right? By sending an email, by going to the Capitol and or a phone call, talking to your legislators, and let them know that you're paying attention. That is something that most people do not do, right? And it doesn't take that much, right? Having 30,000 teachers show up at the Capitol is a powerful statement. That was cool. Uh, but we can have the same effect without having to take off work and be quite so flashy and cold, right? Like we can show up by making phone calls, by sending emails, by having those conversations with our elected officials whenever possible.
Well, speaking of being able to show up in opportunities, there is an opportunity for listeners on Tuesday who live in Oklahoma City to participate in a mayoral election. So, those who are voters in Oklahoma City, be sure that you are showing up to the polls next Tuesday.
That's right. Oklahoma City, Norman, and a bunch of other towns have mayoral elections next week on February 8th. Also, as we wrap up here, well, before we do that, let's say thank you to our guest, Emma Morris. Thank you for being here with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Emma, of course, is a healthcare and finance policy analyst with the Oklahoma Policy Institute. You can learn more about them at okpolicy.org. Bailey and Scott, thank you for being here as well.
Of course. Thank you, Andy.
Wouldn't miss it.
Listeners, thank you for being here. Don't forget, Monday the 7th is the first day of session. The governor will be delivering his State the State address, which I am certain we will all unpack next week here on the podcast and hear what his priorities are for policy and budget. He's already tweeting hints about it being related to education. I'm very curious to see what it actually is. And then, as we said, Tuesday, the 8th is an election for a big chunk of the state. If you don't already know if you have an election, you should go to the election board website, elections.ok.gov, and log in to the voter tool to find out. Make sure that you are showing up for every election for which you are eligible. All right, listeners, that's it for this week. We'll say it again. Decisions are made by those who show up. See you next week.